Have you ever come across someone who made you feel deeply connected, yet at the same time left you completely unsure? Someone who looked at you in a way that made you feel important, but then disappeared as if you never mattered. Stay with this until the end, because what you are about to understand may completely shift how you interpret this kind of connection. It won't just bring you relief, it will help you finally understand what is actually happening within you and within them. Because this is not just confusion, it goes much deeper than that. It begins quietly. At first, everything feels right, natural, almost effortless. There is an unexplainable pull between you. Conversations flow easily, emotions feel heightened, and everything seems to click. You feel understood in a way you may not have experienced before. For a brief moment, it feels like something real is forming. Then, something starts to change. They begin to pull back. Not in a clear or sudden way, but slowly enough that it makes you question yourself. Replies become slower. Their energy shifts. Their warmth fades into distance. And you are left trying to figure out what went wrong. You replay everything in your mind. Every message, every word, every reaction. You search for answers that never arrive. The most painful part is that nothing officially ended. There was no clear rejection, no honest explanation, only silence mixed with emotional distance. This is where confusion starts taking control, because when something ends clearly, your mind can process it. You can grieve it and eventually move on. But when there is no closure, your mind stays stuck. It keeps holding on. You begin asking yourself questions that slowly affect your peace. Did they ever truly care? Was it all just in my head? Why do I feel this strongly if they don't? Without realizing it, your sense of worth starts getting tied to their behavior. When they come closer, you feel valued. When they pull away, you feel rejected. This emotional instability is not random. It has a psychological explanation. You are not weak for feeling it this deeply. The human mind is simply responding the way it is wired to respond. Unpredictability creates emotional attachment. When someone gives attention and then withdraws it, your brain begins to crave it more. It stops being about the person and becomes about the feeling itself. The more inconsistent they are, the stronger the attachment becomes. That is why letting go feels so difficult. Not because they are perfect, but because they are unpredictable. There is another layer most people don't recognize. Avoidant individuals do not experience emotional closeness the same way. For them, intimacy can feel overwhelming or even threatening, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and struggle to manage it. When things start becoming deeper, when emotions intensify, something within them triggers fear. Fear of losing control, fear of dependency, fear of vulnerability, and so they withdraw. Not because you are not enough, but because the emotional closeness feels intense for them. This creates a painful imbalance. For you, closeness means connection. For them, closeness can sometimes mean stepping back. So while you move toward them emotionally, they move away. This cycle becomes exhausting. You try harder, they distance further. You invest more, they retreat more. Slowly, without noticing, you begin to lose your own emotional center. Your focus shifts entirely onto their behavior. You wait for messages, overanalyze tone, and hold on to small moments of attention as if they mean everything. Deep down, part of you senses something is off, yet another part refuses to let go. Because despite everything, the connection still feels real. You are not truly chasing the person. You are chasing the version of them that made you feel seen at the beginning, the version that gave you hope. And your mind keeps telling you that if it felt real once, it must be possible again. But the truth many avoid is that not every strong emotional connection is meant to be stable or easy. Some connections appear to challenge you, test your emotional boundaries, and expose patterns you were not aware of. They force you to see how much emotional inconsistency you can tolerate in the name of attachment. These experiences are rarely peaceful. They are intense, confusing, and mentally draining. Yet they reveal something important about you, how you respond to emotional uncertainty and what you tend to accept in the name of love. And once you begin to see this clearly, something inside you starts shifting. You stop automatically blaming yourself for their distance. You stop chasing clarity from someone who is not providing it. You start recognizing the pattern instead of personalizing it. But even with this awareness, you may still find yourself in the middle of it, still trying to understand why something that feels so real remains so unstable. The answer is not simple, because this is not just about emotions. It is also about psychological patterns between two different attachment styles colliding, and if this is not understood, the cycle repeats over and over again. But once it is understood, your perception changes, not only of them, but also of yourself, and that is where real change begins. So why is it that even when you decide to move on, something pulls you back again and again? You tell yourself it is over. You try focusing elsewhere. You create distance, hoping clarity will finally come. Yet just when you start feeling stable again, they reappear in some form, a message, a reaction, a small sign, and suddenly, everything you rebuilt internally begins to shake. It starts feeling like a loop you did not consciously choose yet cannot fully escape, as if something invisible keeps reconnecting the bond between you. This is not random. When someone enters your emotional world deeply without closure, your mind does not mark it as complete. It remains open-ended, like an unfinished story, and the human brain naturally seeks completion. It keeps revisiting, analyzing, and searching for resolution. Now add inconsistency to this, moments of attention followed by absence, warmth followed by distance, presence followed by silence. This unpredictability creates a strong emotional response. Your brain begins associating that person with reward, but in an unstable pattern, and unpredictability strengthens attachment more than consistency ever could. You begin craving not just them, but the emotional highs they occasionally bring. Even when you try to detach, something within resists, because the emotional system has already been activated. It no longer feels like a choice. At the same time, the other person is not completely unaffected either. Even if they appear distant or detached, the connection still registers within them in their own way. When you pull back, when your energy changes, when you stop reacting the same way, they notice it emotionally, even if not consciously. That shift creates discomfort. Because the dynamic is no longer the same. They are no longer certain of your availability. And that uncertainty often triggers them to reappear in some form, not always with clarity, not always with intention, but just enough to reconnect the emotional thread. And once that happens, the cycle begins again. You open up slightly. You hope again. You think maybe this time it will be different. Then, without warning, distance returns, silence returns, confusion returns, and you find yourself questioning how something so intense can remain so unstable. Over time, this leads many people to doubt themselves. They assume they are too emotional or expecting too much. But the real issue is not emotional intensity, it is emotional inconsistency. Because consistency is what creates safety. Without it, the mind stays alert, always observing, always waiting, never fully relaxed. That is why even when nothing is actively happening, you still feel drained. Your mind is constantly engaged, processing, anticipating, and analyzing. Eventually, this affects how you perceive relationships in general. You begin to normalize uncertainty. You start accepting less emotional stability than you actually need. And intensity starts feeling like depth, even when it is not. But even then, the emotional bond does not simply disappear. It lingers in thoughts that arrive unexpectedly, in memories that feel too vivid, in emotions that resurface without warning. And this is what makes it so difficult to detach. Because logic may suggest letting go, but emotional attachment does not always follow logic. It still feels incomplete. It still feels like something is missing, and that lingering sense creates a quiet expectation inside you, a subtle hope that maybe, at some point, things will finally align. Maybe one day they will realize. Maybe one day the situation will make sense. But while that hope stays alive in the background, something else is quietly developing within you. You are becoming more observant. You are starting to recognize the repetition. You are beginning to question what you are actually being given. And this awareness marks the beginning of change, because once the pattern becomes visible, it cannot be unseen anymore. You start to realize this connection is not only emotional, it is shaping how you behave. It is influencing your decisions. It is even affecting your perception of yourself. And that is where the shift begins internally. You are no longer just experiencing it. You are starting to understand it. And that understanding brings you closer to a moment that changes everything. A moment where you stop reacting on impulse. A moment where you pause before responding. A moment where a different question forms in your mind, not "why are they like this?" but instead, "why am I still allowing this pattern to continue?" And that single shift in questioning changes the entire direction of your thoughts. Because now the focus is no longer on extracting answers from them. It is about confronting something within yourself. And this is where transformation truly begins, because the next stage is no longer centered on the connection itself. It becomes centered on you. And this is the point where many people either slowly lose themselves completely or eventually rediscover who they really are meant to be. That question redirects your attention inward. You stop analyzing their actions and begin examining your own patterns. At first, this feels uncomfortable because you begin to notice what was previously ignored, how much emotional effort you were putting in, how often you adjusted your feelings just to maintain access, how many times you stayed quiet just to avoid disruption, and gradually a difficult truth surfaces. You are not simply involved in the connection. You are carrying it. You are holding together something that was never balanced in the first place. This realization does not feel empowering at the beginning. It feels heavy and unsettling, because it removes the illusion that things were mutual. You can no longer convince yourself that more effort would have changed everything. You can no longer hold on to the belief that persistence alone would create stability. Now things are visible in a way they weren't before. And clarity, although necessary, often arrives with discomfort before it brings relief. This is usually the stage where internal resistance breaks down, not because of what the other person did, but because of what you finally understand about your own role in the pattern. You begin to feel drained, not from emotional connection itself, but from constant overextension. Not from caring, but from caring without balance. And within that exhaustion, something subtle begins to change. Your reactions start to slow. You no longer respond immediately. You stop over-explaining your emotions. You stop chasing reassurance every time uncertainty appears, not because of anger, but because awareness has started replacing impulse. You begin to recognize the cycle. Every time you gave more, it did not stabilize the connection. It only deepened the imbalance. And for the first time, you begin to withdraw your emotional energy slightly. This withdrawal is not forced. It happens naturally as understanding increases. Still, part of you remains attached to the outcome. A part of you still expects things to improve, still hopes the dynamic might shift. But another part of you, a more grounded part, begins choosing differently. You start leaning toward peace instead of intensity. You begin valuing clarity over emotional chaos. You start choosing yourself in small but meaningful ways. And this is where things start to feel unfamiliar, because you are no longer reacting from habit. You are responding from awareness. You are no longer trying to secure their presence. You are protecting your own emotional space instead. This shift naturally creates distance. Not a forced or dramatic separation, but a quiet repositioning of energy. And this is where the dynamic begins to change, because the emotional access you once gave freely is no longer fully available in the same way. The attention they were used to receiving becomes less predictable. The emotional availability they depended on starts to shift, and this creates a reaction. Not always immediate, not always visible, but it happens internally on both sides. When someone begins to lose consistent access to something they took for granted, it creates awareness. They start noticing your absence differently. They begin to sense the change in your responses. And that difference creates discomfort because the previous balance is no longer there. You are no longer chasing. You are no longer waiting in the same way. You are no longer proving your emotional value. And that version of you, the one that was always accessible, is no longer operating the same way. This naturally creates reflection on their side. A space opens that was previously filled with your emotional effort. But that space is no longer automatically occupied, and this shift forces a different kind of awareness. However, this is also the point where many people unintentionally undo their progress, because the moment they sense even slight change from the other side, they return to old patterns. They re-engage too quickly. They reopen emotional access too easily, and the cycle begins again without resolution. But if you stay grounded in what you now see clearly, something deeper begins to form within you. Emotional stability starts growing internally. You stop relying on their behavior to regulate your state. You begin to feel more anchored in yourself. Over time, your perception changes. Temporary attention no longer feels fulfilling. Inconsistent effort no longer feels acceptable. Emotional unpredictability no longer feels like depth. It starts to feel like instability instead, and even then, the emotional connection does not vanish instantly. It still appears in thoughts without warning. It still surfaces through memories. It still lingers in emotional echoes that come and go unexpectedly. This is what makes detachment difficult, because understanding something logically is not the same as disconnecting emotionally from it. The mind may recognize the pattern, but the emotional system takes longer to adjust. It still feels unfinished. It still feels like there is something unresolved, and that feeling creates a quiet form of hope, a belief that maybe at some point things will align differently, maybe understanding will finally arrive, maybe closure will eventually happen. But while that hope exists, something deeper continues developing inside you. Awareness grows stronger. The pattern becomes clearer. Your internal questions become more direct. And this awareness is the first real turning point. Because once the cycle is fully visible, ignoring it becomes harder. You begin to see that this connection is not only influencing your emotions, but also shaping your reactions, your decisions, and your internal self-image. And from this point, everything begins shifting. You are no longer only feeling, you are understanding. And that understanding leads to a powerful internal pause, a moment where automatic reactions begin to weaken, a moment where you begin asking yourself something different, not what they are doing, but what role you are playing in continuing this pattern. And that question shifts everything inward. Now attention turns away from trying to decode them and moves toward understanding yourself. And although this stage feels uncomfortable, it is also where real transformation begins forming quietly, underneath everything else. Because from here, you are no longer reacting unconsciously. You are beginning to observe. And observation changes everything over time. You begin to notice effort, imbalance, emotional overinvestment, and silence where you used to speak. And slowly, truth becomes harder to avoid. You were not simply inside the connection, you were maintaining it disproportionately. And this realization is not light. It creates emotional weight, because it removes the illusion of equality. It removes the idea that things would have balanced out with time alone. But clarity, even when painful, becomes the foundation of change. And from here, your responses begin to shift permanently.